Welcome to the SCORE podcast.
A regulatory assault. That's how the current environment is described by the America's credit unions. And if you've never heard of the organization, it's probably because it was only launched at the beginning of this year. But did you know that the organization represents over 140 million members nationwide? I'm Jeff Richardson, host of the SCORE podcast. It wasn't that long ago the nation's credit unions were actually represented in Washington, D.C. by two industry trade organizations. Maybe you've heard of them. It was the National Association of Federally Insured Credit Unions, or NAFCU, and the Credit Union National Association, or CUNA. These days, the two organizations merged and now leverage their substantial influence to drive positive outcomes for credit unions and their members. But what are those outcomes, and what hurdles exist from achieving them? Today, Carrie Hunt, Chief Advocacy Officer for America's Credit Unions, joins us. Carrie was formerly President and CEO of the Virginia Credit Union League and was previously the Executive Vice President of Government Affairs and General Counsel at the aforementioned NAFCU, which is where I got to know her. She started in the credit union financial services space back in 2001. Carrie, thank you for joining the SCORE podcast.
No, thank you so much, Jeff. I'm excited to chat, and I will note that we are just a couple of days away from hitting the 6-month mark for the merger of CUNA and NAFCU. So even though we are still pretty young, a lot has happened and a lot to talk about.
Yeah, let's get into it. Let's talk about the merger first. So what drove the merger between NAFCU and CUNA, and why is advocating on behalf of credit unions so critical? And let me just mention, I'm a lifelong credit union member of Navy Federal Credit Union since I was 16, so I am very appreciative of all of the work that you all do.
Well, that is wonderful to hear. I really only try to talk to other credit union members, although, from time to time, I do have to break that rule. I also am a lifelong credit union member. My parents worked for the government, and from a very early age, I saw the benefits of credit unions, and it has really inspired me to spend my life and career trying to make sure that others know that as well. As you said, I worked at NAFCU, and I also worked the Virginia Credit Union League, and I feel like I've seen the best of what the CUNA and League system can do in advocacy, and I've seen the best of what NAFCU can do on an advocacy front. And the collective board of directors of CUNA and NAFCU really recognize the benefits of bringing those two trade associations together so that we have a stronger voice in DC and beyond. And for me, that is incredibly exciting, because what I have observed over my career is really just how hard advocacy is, how hard achieving results for credit unions can be. And we need every single resource that we have at our disposal to make sure that credit unions are successful today into the future. And I know later on we're going to talk about some issues, but I really do think that our financial services is changing at such a rapid rate that CUNA and NAFCU had to merge in order to make sure that we are being successful going forward. And, there's a lot to talk about within that.
So let's talk a little bit about the market first before we talk about some of the issues. Maybe outside of the top 2 or 3 larger credit unions, the size and the budget of most credit unions are substantially smaller than the large banks. So how are they able to compete with large banks and fintechs, and how do they access similar technologies as their bank competitors do?
I think first we need to talk about the credit union model in its purest form, because I'm not so sure when Congress created the Federal Credit Union Act in 1934, they really envisioned that the not-for-profit member-owned cooperative model run by, mostly volunteer boards would be one that is so resilient and so successful, spanning decades and decades and decades. And I do think that credit unions being able to focus on the needs and wants of their members, who of course are consumers, is truly the secret to credit union success from a pure connection standpoint and from a standpoint of really understanding consumer needs. Beyond that, though, because credit unions have a different model, they have limited investment authorities. Credit unions have limited fields of membership. Credit unions have lots of opponents in the banks. So there are many, many headwinds that credit unions have to face in order to be successful. And because of the dramatic increase in the cost of doing business, and because of really the dramatic increase in consumer demands, it's just incredibly challenging to be a credit union. And because credit unions can only, for the most part, build capital through retained earnings, they feel these challenges in the market more stringently than banks do. And while they have this beautiful model, which is the absolute best for consumers out there, because of these hurdles, it just becomes more and more challenging to deal with some of these headwinds that they're facing. Technology is both their savior and is also one of their biggest challenges. And I'm happy to talk more about that.
Sometimes the service providers are sort of, it's provided through, I believe that the term is a QSO. Can you explain a little bit about what a QSO is and how that benefits the credit unions?
So credit unions in general themselves can internally create a product or service that they execute towards their membership, or they can partner with a third-party vendor, which may not have any nexus to the credit union, may just be a separate company. Or credit unions can come together and create credit union service organizations, and credit unions can invest up to 1% of their capital in those organizations. So it's a solution. It's a collaborative, cooperative solution, but credit unions have skin in the game and control over that. And the benefit is then they have a degree of management in those entities, so they can make sure that those needs and solutions are serving what the credit union needs. So from a cost perspective, having a credit union service organization allows credit unions to really band together and cut expenses and come up with a solution so they can deliver those products and services in the way their members need and want, and at the same time it's cost effective so they're not having to recreate these things on their own.
A perfect segue to my next question. So a little bit about competition, which is, of course, a topic that's near and dear to VantageScore, as you know. But what are the major issues that have the potential, I suppose, to put credit unions at an unfair competitive disadvantage? What are you focused on in Washington?
Well, there's a lot, Jeff. There's a lot we're focused on in Washington, but one of the biggest buckets is, as I think you alluded to at the top of the podcast, and that's regulation. And what we're seeing is all of these new entrants into the market, which can be a wonderful thing, because typically when you have new parties entering the market, they are having a market-based solution that may be more efficient, more effective, more cost-friendly to consumers. But typically that is because there isn't this history and there aren't these additional requirements that come into play. We have a financial system in our country where, for the most part, financial services are traditionally being provided by depositories, and there's a reason why there are rules and regulations. Some of those are directly related to how consumers are treated, and that means making sure that interest rates are clearly disclosed, making sure that consumers aren't being taken advantage of, ensuring that fair lending laws are being complied with. But then on top of that, as we already talked about, credit unions have a very conservative business model. So they have things like a usury ceiling. Credit unions have to, make sure, again, that they're, staying within their field of membership. So there are a lot of regulatory burdens that credit unions face that some of these other entrants do not. And because of that, and because of credit unions have so much more in terms of the cost of doing business, it puts them at an unfair disadvantage. And that is really fundamentally one of the biggest challenges that we have as the America's Credit Unions New Trade Association, is to keep regulation down so we can keep those costs down so credit unions can just reach more people and serve as many members as possible. And what we're seeing is, we have the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and they have the ability to regulate larger participants in the market. And we are seeing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau start to go down that road and make sure that they are looking at these new entrants. But at the same time, credit unions who partner with vendors and partner with others to provide products in a cost-effective manner need to make sure that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau isn't both regulating the credit union and, from our perspective, overly regulating the credit union and regulating certain products that may be helpful to actual business success. So we have to make sure that our regulators understand the real world impact of some of this regulation. And it has been incredibly challenging to get regulators to really understand the impact of some of the things that they're doing.
One thing I wanted to discuss with you, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but it's an election year. Have you heard? We do hear a lot about bipartisanship and politics and how Congress is hopelessly divided. But, from the VantageScore perspective, one of the issues that we actually see bipartisan support on is competition, specifically credit score competition, and kind of within the framework of a healthy and equitable mortgage market. And that's a topic we've talked extensively about on the podcast. But what are the other areas that maybe you're seeing some level of bipartisanship that can give the listeners, some good feelings about the work that's happening in Washington?
It's funny. We talk a lot about Congress being hopelessly divided, about gridlock, about the fact that we're in this incredibly challenging environment. And that is true. But when you look back at history and how Congress has acted or rather not acted, the period we're in right now certainly has many, many similarities to ones that we have seen in the past. And I think one area we're seeing bipartisanship on are things like access to capital. And everyone agrees that we need to have a robust economy and making sure that financial institutions, including credit unions, have the ability to lend is absolutely something that everyone agrees on. Credit unions have had success with the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, credit unions using the CDFI fund and some specific rules to put capital out in the communities is something that it's been very successful, and we would love to see more money and more partnerships in that regard. We started to see some discussion and unity on privacy, having a uniform privacy standard. And, I think those talks will likely derail and we're not going to see anything in this Congress, but there's definitely progress being made in that regard. I think that how Congress is embracing and looking at things like open banking and recognizing that we need to take steps forward. So even though we may not see legislation being formally passed here in this election year, we are having hearings and discussions on issues, and then we will be poised, depending on who is in the White House and depending on what that congressional composition looks like from a party standpoint, to see some things passed that help credit unions. At America's Credit Unions, we have a really robust agenda, and I sit in my seat with my peers and under the direction of our board and the full input of all of our members. And we come up with our priorities for the year. And whether or not we're successful at achieving those priorities depends, of course, on the environment that we're in, depends on the resources and support we have with some of our coalition partners external to the credit union space to really boots on the ground, specifically lobby members of Congress to understand why our policy concerns are so important and achieve change. Well, it's a long game, and America's Credit Unions is here to make sure that we are actively engaging in that long game to check off the list all of those things, which will ultimately help credit unions stay vibrant.
Well, Carrie, we appreciate the efforts and the work. I know it sometimes can be a slog down there, particularly when the weather's 95 degrees with 100% humidity. But we do appreciate everything you're doing and the support of the nation's credit unions. And for listeners, if they want to find out more about the America's Credit Unions organization, where should they go?
They can go to our website, www.americascreditunions.org. They're also certainly welcome to reach out to me directly as well. I also want to give my thanks to VantageScore in terms of a lot of the work that you all do. It is innovation, which is the key to our success going forward, and coming up with business solutions to address what we're seeing in the market is incredibly important. And I applaud you for all the work that you do.
We love our credit union members and users, and flattery gets you everywhere on the Score podcast. Carrie, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much. Have a great one.
Today, credit unions serve more than 140 million Americans with an economic impact of over $219 billion. Here's a few other fast facts about credit unions. There are over 4,745 total credit unions in operation that employ some 979,000 workers. Collectively, they provide over $28 billion in total consumer financial benefits. And interestingly, after the 2008 financial crisis, credit unions stepped in when banks couldn't. Credit union lending was 15% higher than banks in the years following the financial crisis. So they play a critical role, and their advocacy efforts are grounded in the desire to serve their members. I'm Jeff Richardson, and I look forward to our next conversation.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of VantageScore Solutions. Visit VantageScore.com to learn more.